She stood at the altar, believing she had finally found love. Then he took the microphone and destroyed her in front of the entire city. But the man who walked through those cathedral doors next would change everything. This is the story of a woman who was broken in public and rebuilt herself into something the world had never seen coming. If this story hits different, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The cathedral had been built to make people feel small. That was what Celeste Holloway thought as she stood in the anteroom off the main nave, one hand pressed flat against the cold stone wall, the other clutching a bouquet of white peonies so tightly that the stems had started to bend. She could hear the organ music filtering through the heavy oak door. Something classical, something her mother had chosen, something Celeste had nodded along to during the planning meetings without really hearing any of it. She'd been nodding along to things her whole life, agreeing to flowers she didn't care about, to seating charts that prioritized her father's business partners over her actual friends, to a dress that had cost $43,000 and had been altered 3 times because the designer kept suggesting minor adjustments that weren't minor at all. She looked down at the dress now. The way the silk caught the light filtering through the single high window in the anteroom, it was almost beautiful. Almost. The corset had been built with reinforced boning along the sides, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The skirt fell in heavy folds that were designed to suggest rather than reveal. It was a masterwork of structural engineering disguised as couture, and Celeste had stood in front of 3 separate mirrors while women with measuring tapes and careful smiles told her it was perfect. She'd wanted to believe them. She'd been wanting to believe people her entire life. That was the problem with her, or at least it was the problem everyone seemed to agree on when they thought she couldn't hear them. Too trusting, too soft, too much of everything that wasn't supposed to be visible on a woman of her standing. The Holloways had built their name on precision and restraint. Her father, Edmund Holloway, had turned a mid-sized textile concern into a diversified holdings corporation worth north of $4 billion. Her mother, Patricia, had done what women like her did. She had attended the right events, smiled in the right photographs, worn the right clothes, and produced one child who was supposed to inherit the legacy. That child had grown up to be Celeste. And Celeste had grown up wrong. Not wrong in any way that showed up on a balance sheet. She had the degrees, Columbia undergraduate, Wharton MBA. A mind for numbers that her father's CFO once described as borderline frightening. She had the work ethic, the instincts, the discipline, but she also had hips that no amount of expensive tailoring could make disappear, a face that was striking rather than conventional, a body that existed in a size range that Manhattan society treated as a personal failure, and a laugh that was too loud and happened too often and made people glance at each other across dinner tables. She had Grayson Vale, which was supposed to fix everything. Grayson was the kind of man that places like this cathedral were built for. 6'2", jaw like something a sculptor would approve of, old money on his father's side and new media influence on his mother's. He wore a suit the way other men wore skin, naturally, effortlessly, as if the fabric had grown there. He said the right things at the right moments. He had held Celeste's hand at charity galas and business dinners and had never once seemed embarrassed by her. And she had held on to that fact like a life raft for 2 years. 2 years. 730 days of telling herself that the small humiliations were nothing. The times he'd gently suggested she order the salad. The times he'd steered her away from certain photographs. The times she'd caught him looking at someone else and he'd smoothed it over so easily, so warmly, with a hand at her lower back and a smile aimed directly at her insecurities, that she'd ended up apologizing to him for noticing. She told herself that love looked like that. She told herself that imperfection was part of it. Standing in this anteroom in $43,000 worth of structural engineering, 3 minutes from walking down an aisle toward the man who was going to fix everything, Celeste Holloway told herself one more time. She believed it. She pushed open the door. The nave of the cathedral opened up around her and swallowed every reasonable thought she had left. 312 guests. She'd counted the RSVPs herself, turned in their pews, and the organ music swelled into something that was supposed to feel like triumph, and her father appeared at her elbow with an expression she recognized as pride worn over anxiety, and the aisle stretched out ahead of her like a dare. She walked. Her heels were custom, 2 inches because anything higher made her feel like she was performing rather than existing, and she'd stood firm on that even when the dress designer had suggested 3. Small rebellion. She collected them like other people collected stamps, tiny moments of choosing herself that she could count on the bad days to prove she was still in there somewhere. Grayson was at the altar. He looked extraordinary. Of course he did. He always looked extraordinary. His best man, a college friend named Thatcher something, stood 2 steps behind him with the expression of a man who'd had 3 drinks at the pre-ceremony gathering and was working to look sober. The officiant stood center, robes pressed, notes in hand. The altar flowers were white and gold and cascading and had cost more than Celeste's first car. She reached the altar. Her father kissed her cheek. His lips barely made contact, a gesture trained by decades into something that communicated affection without actually delivering it, and stepped back into the front pew where her mother was already sitting with perfect posture and a handkerchief that would remain unneeded. She faced Grayson. He was looking at her, but there was something wrong with the look. She couldn't name it immediately, which was itself a kind of warning her body registered before her mind caught up. Her pulse shifted. A small thing. The kind of thing you could explain away. The officiant began. The words were familiar. She'd heard them at other weddings. The formal preamble, the gathering language, the acknowledgement of witnesses. She'd listened to Grayson practice his vows in the hotel suite last night, reading from the card in his jacket pocket, and they'd been fine. Generic, but fine. She hadn't written anything too personal herself because personal felt dangerous, felt like too much exposure in a room that was already demanding a lot of her. The officiant reached the moment, the turning point, the "do you take this?" And Grayson moved. It was subtle at first, a slight shift of his weight, a turning of his body away from the officiant and toward the congregation. His right hand moved to the inside of his jacket. She thought for one wild, lurching second that he was reaching for the vow card, that he was going to say something unrehearsed, that this was the moment he surprised her. He pulled out a microphone. A wireless microphone. Small, matte black, the kind that a performer would use. He must have had someone plant it there, tucked into a small bracket on the underside of the altar's edge. He must have arranged this in advance. He must have... She was still processing the mechanics of it when he lifted it to his lips, and the sound system that had been feeding the organ music and nothing else suddenly made his voice enormous. "Actually," Grayson said, and his voice filled every cubic foot of that ancient space, "I need to say something first." The organ stopped. Celeste stood still. He turned to face the congregation, and his expression was not the expression of a man in love. It was not even the expression of a man who was nervous or uncertain or about to do something he regretted. It was the expression of a man who had planned something and was about to execute it, and there was a cleanness to it, a terrible efficiency, that she would think about for a long time afterward. "I appreciate everyone being here today," he said. The acoustics were perfect. His voice was measured and pleasant and utterly without warmth. "I genuinely do. And I want to be honest with all of you, because I think that's what a moment like this deserves." Murmuring in the pews. She heard it the way you hear things when blood is rushing in your ears. Distant, softened, like sound through water. "I've spent 2 years building a relationship with Celeste Holloway." He paused. Building. That's the operative word. Because that's what this was. A construction project. The murmuring stopped. Celeste's bouquet hit the floor before she realized she'd dropped it. "The Holloway Corporation," Grayson continued, turning slightly so his profile caught the light in a way that suggested he'd thought about this, "is worth somewhere in the range of $4 billion. Most of that is tied up in the founder's shares, which, under the terms of Edmund Holloway's estate planning, would transfer in significant part to any spouse of a Holloway child upon the execution of a prenuptial agreement." He reached into his jacket again and produced a document. "I had my legal team prepare a very thorough prenup. You signed it, Celeste, 4 weeks ago at that restaurant in Tribeca. You thought it was standard." Her father's voice from the first pew, low and dangerous. "What is this?" "It wasn't standard," Grayson said pleasantly. "But that's a conversation for the lawyers." He looked at Celeste for the first time since he'd picked up the microphone. The look he gave her was not cruelty for its own sake. It was something colder than that. It was the look of a man who had already moved on and was performing a necessary administrative step. "You're a smart woman," he said. "Genuinely. in certain respects. But you have always had exactly one significant weakness, and I want you to know I recognized it immediately." He tilted his head. "You don't believe you deserve what you have. You've never believed it. You walk into rooms apologizing for taking up space. You dress to disappear. You say sorry before you've done anything wrong." His voice was the same throughout, pleasant, even, controlled. It made you very easy to manage. She heard someone in the pews make a sound. A woman. A sharp inhalation. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend I ever felt something for you that I didn't." He glanced down at her dress. A quick and comprehensive glance that said everything he would have been too polished to say with words, except that he said the words too. "You're a means to an end, Celeste. A very well-dressed means to an end, I'll give you that. The people who put that thing together know their job." Another pause. "The thing you're wearing." It took her a moment to understand he was referring to her body, or her dress, or both. The distinction had apparently ceased to matter to him. She didn't move. She understood distantly that she should do something, that there was a correct action available to her. Walk away. Say something. Look somewhere other than his face. But her body had decided to route all available resources to the task of remaining upright, and there was nothing left for anything else. "I think you all know what I'm saying," Grayson told the congregation, and his voice was almost apologetic now, the way a doctor's voice gets when they're delivering bad news to someone they can't really bring themselves to care about. "The marriage isn't happening. The legal matter will sort itself out. And Celeste..." He looked at her again, and this time there was something in the look that was almost genuine, almost human, which was somehow worse than the coldness. "I genuinely hope you find what you're looking for. You're just not going to find it here. You bitch am I chen." He lowered the microphone. He didn't leave. He just stepped back slightly, creating a physical distance from her, and stood there with his hands loose at his sides and that same clean expression, waiting for the situation to resolve itself around him, because that was what men like Grayson did. They created messes and then stood in them with excellent posture and waited for the mess to become someone else's problem. 312 people were watching her. Her father was on his feet. She could see him in her peripheral vision, his face a color she'd never seen on him, his hand reaching toward his inside pocket where his cell phone was. And she understood that whatever was happening for her father in this moment was about the prenup and the corporation and the legal exposure, and that her father's instinct upon watching his daughter be publicly eviscerated was to call his attorney. Her mother had not moved. Her mother's handkerchief remained in her lap, untouched. Celeste became aware that she was breathing. That was the thing she focused on, the mechanical fact of her own lungs moving, because it was the only thing in the room that was happening for her benefit and not for someone else's. She thought, "I am 31 years old, and I am standing at an altar in a dress that was built to make me look smaller than I am, and I have just been told in front of my entire world that I was a transaction." She thought, "I have been apologizing for myself since I was 17 years old, and I don't know how to stop." She thought, "I dropped the bouquet." She looked down at it. White peonies on a stone floor. The stems had bent on impact, and one of the blooms was crushed slightly. The petals splayed outward in a way that was almost violent. She bent and picked it up. She didn't know why. It seemed important. It seemed like the only thing in the room she could actually touch and have it mean something. So she picked up the crushed flowers and held them in both hands. And when she straightened back up, she was looking at Grayson Vale. And for the first time in 2 years, she was looking at him without apologizing for it. The rage came slowly. That surprised her. She'd expected panic. She'd expected the blinding kind of shame that she'd carried around so long it had started to feel like weather. Constant, unavoidable, environmental. She'd expected to cry, and she hadn't cried, and she didn't understand why not. And then she realized she'd been crying her whole life, quietly, in private, over smaller things than this. She had used up a certain amount of tears on smaller indignities, and this one was too large for tears. It was past the scale where tears were the appropriate instrument. What she felt instead was the particular cold clarity of someone who has just been told an important truth. She was a transaction. She had known it, somewhere under everything, the way you know things you refuse to think about directly. She had decorated the knowledge with excuses and explanations and the warm light of wanting it to be different, and she had lived in the decorated version for 2 years, and now the decorations were on the floor with the peonies, and she was looking at the thing itself. The rage was cold and clean, and it didn't shake her hands. She was going to say something. She had opened her mouth to say it. She didn't know what it was yet, but it was rising in her, and it would be something that she wouldn't regret, something that the people in these pews would remember. When the cathedral doors opened. Not opened. Slammed. Both of them, simultaneously, with a force that sent sound reverberating up into the vaulted ceiling in a percussion that silenced every whisper, every shifting of weight, every barely suppressed murmur in the room. 312 people turned away from the altar. The light from outside was at midday angles, sharp and white, and the figure who entered it came through it as a silhouette first. Then the doors swung back on their own momentum, and the light fell differently, and Celeste could see him. She didn't know who he was. She would learn. Everyone in that room already knew, which was something she would also learn. And the knowledge of it, the fact that his name alone had caused the temperature of the room to drop several degrees before he'd taken a single step toward the altar, would tell her everything she needed to know about the nature of power and the many forms it took. But in that first moment, looking at him across 300 feet of ancient stone floor, she knew two things without being told. He was someone, and he was angry. Angry was too small a word. He walked. The way Fury walked when it had been well-trained and expensive-suited and had somewhere specific to be. He wore all black, jacket, shirt, trousers, shoes, and the suit fit him the way Grayson's suit fit him, effortlessly, but on this man it read differently. On Grayson, the suit was performance. On this man, the suit was incidental. It covered a body that had been built for purposes the suit did not advertise. He was somewhere north of 40, she would estimate later, though the number felt wrong somehow, because his face had the kind of structure that made age into a feature rather than a fact. Dark hair, cut short, a jaw that had some history in it, eyes that she couldn't read from this distance and didn't fully want to. He stopped 20 feet from the altar. He looked at Grayson Vale, who had just publicly dismantled a woman in front of hundreds of witnesses without his voice shaking once, took half a step backward. "Who the hell are you?" Grayson asked. His voice had changed. The pleasant control was still mostly there, but there was something else in it now. A tightening, the way a rope goes when it's being tested. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked at Celeste. It was not the look Grayson had given her, the evaluating, categorizing, dismissing look. It was a different kind of look entirely. Direct and still and without apology. And it contained something she couldn't name, which was that it seemed to see her. Not her dress, not her family's balance sheet, not the strategic value of her signature on a document. Her. She was aware distantly that this was an irrational thing to read into a look from a stranger across an expanse of cathedral floor. She was aware that she was in shock, and that shock did things to perception. She filed it under unreliable narrator and held on to the crushed peonies. The man looked back at Grayson. "My name," he said, "is Nico Serrano." The sound that went through the room was not a sound. It was the absence of sound. A collective, instantaneous cessation of breathing that was more expressive than anything any of the 312 people present could have said out loud. Celeste watched the color leave Grayson's face. She watched it happen in real time, like a tide going out, and she thought, he knows that name. Everyone here knows that name. I am the only person in this room who doesn't know that name. She would rectify that. Beginning now. Nico Serrano took 3 more steps toward the altar and stopped. He was close enough now that she could see his eyes clearly. Dark brown, almost black. There were things living behind those eyes that she suspected most people spent their lives working very hard to avoid making contact with. "You're done speaking," Nico said to Grayson. His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the voice of a man who had never needed volume, because volume was for people whose authority required announcing. "I'm going to ask you to step back from the altar and keep your mouth closed, and I'm going to give you exactly one opportunity to do that without consequences." Grayson's jaw tightened. He was not a man who responded well to being told to step back. He was a man who had spent his entire life stepping forward, into rooms, into situations, into a woman's careful hope, and dismantled it for profit. Being asked to retreat in front of 300 witnesses activated something in him that was uglier than anything he'd said through the microphone. "I don't know who you are," Grayson said, which was a lie that everyone in the room understood to be a lie. And I don't know what you think you're doing here, but this is a private event, and you're going to want to turn around. Nico looked at him for a long moment. That's unfortunate, he said simply. He moved to Celeste, not in a threatening way, not toward her but alongside her, positioning himself at her side with the particular spatial confidence of a man who understands geometry as a form of communication. He stood between her and Grayson without making it a dramatic gesture. It was purely functional, like putting a hand between a flame and something you'd rather not see burn. He looked at her sidelong. Are you all right? He asked. It was such a simple question. It was the most basic possible question a human being could ask another human being in a moment of distress, and no one had asked it. Not her father, who was calling his attorney. Not her mother, who had not moved. Not Thatcher, the best man, who had quietly sat down in a pew and was looking at his phone. Not one single person in a room full of 312 people had thought to ask whether she was all right. Celeste looked at this man, this stranger, this name that had emptied the air out of the room, and said the first honest thing she'd said in this cathedral all day. No, she said, I'm not. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't softness exactly. The word felt wrong for a face structured the way his was. But there was a quality to it that she might call recognition, the look of a person who understands something they already knew. No, he agreed. You're not, and you shouldn't be. He turned to face Grayson fully then, and whatever had been living behind those dark eyes came forward. Here's what I know about you, Nico said to Grayson, and his voice was still quiet, but now there was nothing casual about the quiet. It was the particular quiet of something that has made a decision. I know your net operating losses for the past 3 fiscal years. I know about the debt restructuring your family's holding company completed 18 months ago. I know about the conversation you had with your attorney in December regarding the Holloway prenuptial clause. He paused. I know about the woman in the Hamptons. Grayson said nothing. You didn't love her, Nico continued. You auditioned her. You did it carefully. I'll give you that. You were patient. 2 years is a long time to be patient. The dark eyes didn't move from Grayson's face. But you weren't patient because you had feelings. You were patient because the payout required it, and when you were satisfied that you had what you needed. He glanced very briefly at the document Grayson was still holding, the prenup that wasn't standard. You chose to end it in a way that was specifically designed to humiliate her so thoroughly that she wouldn't have the standing to effectively contest anything. Grayson's hand tightened on the microphone. I'd put that down, Nico said. Grayson put it down. You made a calculation, Nico continued, about what she would and wouldn't do, about how much damage she'd accept before she fought back. You looked at her and you saw someone who had been taught her whole life that she was less than, and you decided to use that, to weaponize the thing that had been done to her already. A pause that felt deliberate. That's not just dishonest. That's cowardly. And I have a particular problem with cowardice. The silence in the cathedral was complete. Then Nico turned to Celeste, and the look on his face was not the look of a man doing something for strategic reasons, or the look of a man about to make a move in a game he'd been playing longer than anyone else in the room realized. It was, and she would spend a lot of time trying to find a better word for this and fail, the look of a man who had been waiting. I'm going to say something to you, he said quietly, and it was quiet enough now that the people in the nearest pews had to lean forward slightly. And I want you to understand that I'm not saying it to humiliate anyone, or to make a point, or to win something. I'm saying it because I should have said it a long time ago, and I didn't, and that's on me. Celeste held the crushed peonies. For the last 4 years, Nico said, I've watched you, not the way that sounds. The briefest flicker of something human across his face. You sit on the board of the Meridian Community Foundation. 4 years ago, when the community center on Lenox Avenue was about to lose its building, the foundation was the deciding vote. Every major donor had pulled out. The real estate value of that block had tripled, and everyone wanted to sell. He held her gaze. You voted to keep it open. You argued for 2 hours in a board meeting, and then when the vote still went the wrong way, you reached into your own money. Not your family's, your own. And you made up the shortfall anonymously. She stared at him. That center was built by my mother, Nico said, 30 years ago, before I was what I am. Before any of this. a slight gesture. Himself, the room, the implication of everything the room contained. She spent 4 years building that place from nothing, and when she died, it was the only thing she left behind that she was proud of. And you saved it, without knowing what it was, without anyone asking you to, without putting your name on it. The peonies had started to shake. Celeste realized her hands were shaking, and she tightened her grip on the stems and made them stop. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Her voice came out lower than she intended, more controlled. "Because you're standing at an altar," he said, "where someone just told you that no one has ever seen you, and that's not true. I've seen you. I've seen you for 4 years, and I never did anything about it because—" He stopped, the briefest pause. "Because I told myself it wasn't my place. Because the world you live in and the world I live in aren't supposed to intersect. Because I convinced myself you were better off without the complications that come with my name." He looked at her with those dark, complete eyes. "I was wrong," he said, "and I'm here." The congregation had ceased to exist as a factor in this conversation. Celeste was aware of them the way you're aware of background traffic, present, audible, entirely irrelevant to the thing happening in front of you. "I'm going to ask you something," Nico said, "and I want you to understand that whatever you answer, that answer stands. I will walk out of those doors, and I will make sure that what he tried to do to you today costs him everything that matters to him, and you will never have to think about me again." She waited. "Or," he said. His voice didn't change. The word arrived with the same weight as everything before it. No build-up, no ceremony. "You could marry me. Today. Right now. In front of all of them." The air in the cathedral changed the way air changes before a storm. Celeste heard her mother make a sound. She heard her father say something to someone. His attorney, probably, still on the phone. A hushed and furious sidebar that had nothing to do with her. She heard Grayson laugh, a single sharp exhalation that was supposed to sound incredulous and sounded instead like fear. She looked at Nico Serrano. She looked at the room around her, the pity in the faces she recognized, the barely concealed satisfaction in the faces of people who had never liked the Holloways, the stunned blankness of the people who were still processing what they were witnessing. She looked at Grayson, who was standing 3 feet away with the expression of a man who had just lost control of a situation he had choreographed down to the last detail. She thought about this woman in the anteroom 3 minutes ago, pressing her hand flat against cold stone and telling herself one more time. She thought about 17 years of, "I'm sorry." She thought about the dress with the boning and the heels that were 2 inches instead of 3, and the laugh that was too loud and the body that took up too much space, and the girl who had grown up inside all of that and had somehow survived it and had done things. Real things, actual things, a community center on Lenox Avenue, without ever being given credit for them. She thought about rage that was cold and clean and didn't shake her hands. "I have some conditions," she said. Nico Serrano looked at her, and something in him went still, in a way that she would later understand was not stillness, but the opposite of it. A concentration of energy, a quality of absolute attention. "Name them," he said. "I'm not doing this to punish him," she said. "I don't want this to be about him. I don't want today to be a story that has him in the middle of it." Nico considered this. "What do you want it to be?" "I want it to be mine," she said. "Whatever happens next, I want to choose it. Not because I'm desperate, and not because I'm humiliated, and not because I need someone to rescue me." Her voice was steady. She surprised herself. "I've been making decisions based on what I'm afraid of for a long time. I'm done with that." Nico held her gaze. "So I'll ask you again," she continued, and the cold clarity in her own voice was something she recognized from boardrooms and budget meetings, from the parts of herself she'd always trusted even when she couldn't trust much else. "Are you asking me to marry you? As a person? Not as a strategy, not as a statement, not as something to put in front of him. As a person," Nico said. No hesitation. "Whatever else I am, whatever else this looks like to anyone in this room, I'm asking as a person." She looked at him for a long moment. The crushed peonies in her hands had started to drop petals onto the stone floor. "Then yes," Celeste Holloway said. The sound that went through the cathedral was not applause. It was something more complex than that, a collective rupture of expectation, 312 people rewriting in real time what they thought they were watching. Someone in the back rows started speaking at full volume, which broke some kind of dam, and suddenly the room was loud with it. Grayson Vale stepped forward. "You can't be serious," he said, and his voice had lost all pretense of control. It was raw now, genuinely raw, which was the first honest thing he'd communicated all day. "You don't know who this man is. You don't know what you're—" "I know that he asked me a question, and you told me an answer," Celeste said. She looked at Grayson for what she decided in that moment would be the last time she would look at him as someone who mattered. "There's a difference." Grayson's face went through several things very quickly. Nico stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Celeste and Grayson with the same spatial efficiency as before. And he said something to Grayson in a voice low enough that only the two of them could hear it. And whatever he said made Grayson go very still, and then step back again until he was standing at a distance that communicated clearly and physically that he had understood something. Nico turned back to Celeste. "The officiant is still here," he observed. She looked at the officiant, who was standing at the center of the altar with the expression of a person who had dedicated their professional life to love and found themselves unexpectedly at the epicenter of something they had no preparation for. They were holding their notes. Their hands were steady, which she respected. "You up for this?" she asked them. The officiant looked from her to Nico and back to her, swallowed, nodded. "Yes," they said. "I believe so." "Good," Celeste said. She looked down at the crushed peonies one more time. One of the blooms had lost most of its petals. The stems were bent at a wrong angle, and the water pick at the base had come loose and was trailing a thin thread of water onto the stone. It was not a beautiful bouquet anymore, if it had ever really been. She set it down on the altar. Then she turned to face the man she had met 17 minutes ago, in whose home she had never set foot, whose world she did not yet understand, whose name had drained the color from 312 faces. And she straightened her spine in the corset that had been designed to contain her, and she waited for the words to begin. What she did not see, what no one in the cathedral saw, because attention is a finite resource and all of it was pointed at the altar, was the man standing in the side aisle near the confessional booths, half hidden in the shadow of a stone pillar. He wore a gray suit that was not as expensive as most of the suits in the room. He had a phone pressed to his ear, and he had been on that call since Nico Serrano walked through the doors, and he was speaking in a low and urgent voice to someone on the other end who was listening very carefully. He looked at Celeste. He looked at Nico. He looked at Grayson, who was standing 15 feet from the altar with his jaw clenched and his hands open at his sides, the posture of a man committing something to memory. Then the man in the gray suit melted back into the shadow and was gone. The ceremony began. 3 blocks away, in a town car idling at the curb outside the cathedral, a phone rang. The man who answered it listened for 45 seconds and then said 2 words. "Start it." The ceremony took 11 minutes. Celeste counted them. Not intentionally. Her mind did it the way her mind did most things under duress, latching on to the measurable because the measurable was manageable. 11 minutes from the moment the officiant cleared their throat and found their place in the notes to the moment they said the words that made it legal. And in those 11 minutes, the cathedral went through several distinct emotional climates that she was aware of only peripherally. The way you're aware of weather when you're inside a burning building. Her father stood up at the 4-minute mark. She heard him, but didn't look. He said her name once, then said it again with a different inflection. The first was a question, the second was a warning. And when neither produced a response, he sat back down. She heard her mother say something to him in a very low voice, the tone of a woman who had lived 40 years inside a marriage built on calculation and recognized the architecture of this moment even if she couldn't name it. Grayson didn't speak again. She was aware of him the way you're aware of a splinter, a persistent, specific discomfort in her peripheral vision, present, contained, not yet requiring action. He stood where he'd retreated to, and he watched, and his face went through several things that she felt rather than saw, like weather changes that you register in your joints before you see the sky shift. Nico stood beside her with the stillness of someone who had been in rooms with higher stakes than this and had learned to conserve everything: movement, expression, breath, for moments that required expenditure. She could feel the warmth of him at her left side. It was strange, that detail, the physical specificity of another person's body heat, when you hadn't chosen to be this close to them yet. When yet was a word that meant something uncertain. She said the words when the officiant indicated she should say them. Her voice didn't shake. She'd thought it might. She'd been braced for it. The telltale tremor that had betrayed her in presentations, in confrontations, in the moment 2 years ago when she'd tried to tell Grayson something true about herself and felt her voice go reedy and soft, and had watched his expression shift into the particular patient tolerance that she'd mistaken for affection. But her voice didn't shake. It came out level and clean, and she understood this was the cold rage still doing its work, burning off everything non-essential, leaving only what held. Nico said his words without looking at anything except her face. When it was done, the officiant looked between them with the expression of a person who has just officiated the strangest ceremony of their career and is not entirely certain the ground beneath them is still solid. They announced it. They said the legal words. And then, because someone had to do something, Nico did the thing that was expected of him, and it was brief and careful, and Celeste registered it as a data point. This is where we are. This is what this is. And then it was over. 312 people did not know what to do with their hands. Someone started clapping, then stopped. Then a different person started, and this one continued long enough to become its own small absurdity, and then it spread because that's what social discomfort does. It finds a release valve, and everyone uses it simultaneously out of sheer relief at having something to do. Nico's hand found the small of her back. Light, barely there. A question rather than an assumption. She didn't move away from it. "My car is outside," he said, close enough to her ear that the words belonged only to her. "Whenever you're ready." "I need a minute," she said. "Take whatever you need." She turned to find her father. Edmund Holloway had aged since the pre-ceremony photographs, which had been taken less than 2 hours ago. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be visible to a stranger, but she knew her father's face the way you know the faces of people who shaped you, and the past 2 hours had done something to the arrangement of it. A settling, like a building after an earthquake. He was 63, and he'd built everything he had through a combination of genuine intelligence and ruthless focus, and a particular variety of cold-bloodedness that he'd always insisted was just pragmatism. And right now, he looked like a man who had miscalculated something fundamental. He was standing in the side aisle when she found him, phone still in hand, and when he saw her coming, his expression moved through several things and landed on something she recognized, the look he used in board meetings when he was buying time. "Celeste," he kept his voice low, "I need you to tell me you know what you're doing." "I need you to tell me you knew about the prenup," she said. A pause. The pause was its own answer, but she waited for the words. "The prenup was reviewed by our legal team," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked." His jaw tightened. Marcus flagged some of the language as aggressive. "I told him we'd revisit it after..." "After," she repeated. "After what?" "After the ceremony." He said it like a man reading a document he hadn't written, careful with each syllable. "There were provisions that concerned me. I wanted to address them in a more appropriate setting." The cold in her chest went colder. "You knew," she said. Not an accusation, more like a verdict. "I knew there were concerns," he said. "I did not know the full extent of what he intended. I want to be very clear about that." He looked at her with eyes that were almost her eyes. The same shape, the same particular shade of brown that she'd always found strange in the mirror. "I would not have let you walk into something designed to harm you. Whatever you think of how I've handled this, I want you to believe that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the phone he'd reached for. She thought about the attorney, not the daughter. "I do believe you didn't know all of it," she said. "I also believe that when you found out some of it, your first call was to Marcus and not to me." He didn't answer. "I have to go," she said. "Celeste." His hand on her arm, brief and deliberate. "You just married Nico Serrano." "I know. Do you understand what that means?" She looked at his hand on her arm until he removed it. "I understand it better than you think," she said. "And I understood Grayson Vale less than you thought, so I'd say we're even." She left him standing in the side aisle. Her mother was waiting near the entrance to the nave, which surprised her. Patricia Holloway did not generally position herself in spaces that suggested waiting. She arrived and she was received. That was the architecture of her social movement. But she was standing near the end of the last pew, with her handkerchief finally in her hands and her posture only slightly less perfect than usual. And when Celeste reached her, she looked at her daughter with an expression that was not pity. It was something closer to recognition. "He's not what I would have chosen," her mother said. "No," Celeste agreed. "He's going to be complicated." "Yes." "You know his reputation." "I'm learning it." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and adjusted something at Celeste's collar. A tiny thing, a small gesture, the kind of physical correction that had been her primary mode of maternal expression for 31 years. But this time, her fingers stayed a moment longer than necessary, and when she pulled her hand back, there was something in her face that Celeste filed away to think about later, when she had space. "Don't let him make you small," her mother said. "The other one did. I saw it, and I said nothing. And I shouldn't have said nothing." A pause that had weight in it. "Don't let this one do the same." Celeste looked at her mother. "I won't," she said, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant anything in a long time. Outside the cathedral, the city was doing what the city always did, which was continue. The light was hard and direct, mid-afternoon in Manhattan, and the street in front of the cathedral was thick with cars, and the particular chaos of a high-profile event discharging its guests into a Thursday that had no frame for any of this. There were photographers, not wedding photographers, but the other kind, the ones with long lenses and no invitations who'd gotten word that something had happened and were stationed at the perimeter, and the sound of them was the rapid mechanical percussion of people trying to capture something they didn't yet fully understand. Nico's car was a black SUV, large and non-distinct in the way that expensive security vehicles were non-distinct, and there was a man standing at the rear door who was built like a decision had been made about him at birth, and everything since had been in service of executing it. He opened the door without being asked when they approached. Celeste got in. The door closed, and the sounds of the street became something that was happening to someone else, and the interior of the SUV was cool and leather-smelled, and very quiet, and she sat in it and breathed. Nico got in the other side. The driver, she hadn't seen the driver's face, pulled into traffic without being told. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the city moving past the tinted windows and tried to take a complete inventory of what she knew. She was married. She had been married twice in one day, which was a sentence she had never anticipated applying to her life. She was in a car with a man whose full name had silenced 300 people and whose reputation she was still assembling from fragments. She had walked out of her family's world in the most visible way possible, and she could already feel the machinery of consequence beginning to turn. She also felt, and this was the thing she was least prepared for, something that was not relief exactly, but was in the same vicinity. The clean feeling of having made a choice, finally, without apologizing for it. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My house," Nico said. "In Westchester. It's about 40 minutes in this traffic." He paused. "We can go somewhere else if you'd prefer. A hotel." "I can have—" "Your house is fine," she said. He nodded. She looked at him for the first time since the ceremony. He was looking forward, not at her, giving her space in the way that people do when they understand that space is what's needed, and she was grateful for it and also intensely curious about it. She studied his profile, the jaw, the slight forward lean of someone accustomed to being where things happen, the hands resting on his knees, still and broad, and bearing the faded evidence of a life that suits didn't fully cover. "Tell me the things I need to know," she said. He turned to look at her. "There are a lot of things," he said. "Then start with the ones that are most likely to affect me in the next 24 hours. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. "My name makes you a target," he said. "Not immediately. Not today. But people who want to get to me will see you as leverage. And that's not a hypothetical. It's a pattern. I have security measures in place. My estate is defended. My people are capable." He held her gaze. "But I want you to know what it is before you walk through my front door." "I already walked through it," she said. "I walked through it back there in front of 300 people. That's different. That was a public moment. My house is different." "How?" He considered this. "It's real." She thought about that. "What about Grayson?" she asked. The quality of the silence changed. Grayson Vale is going to have a very difficult period, Nico said. I'm not asking you to do anything to him on my behalf. I know. His voice was even. I'm not doing anything on your behalf. He involved himself in things that were already my business long before you were in the picture. The consequences he's about to experience are for those things. She looked at him steadily. What things? He borrowed from people connected to my operation, Nico said. 3 years ago, when his family's holding company needed liquidity. He borrowed without disclosing the full terms to the lenders, which is a form of dishonesty that tends to accumulate interest in ways that aren't financial. He paused. He's been managing that debt by working toward the Holloway acquisition. Without the prenup yielding what he needed, the people he borrowed from are going to become impatient. And you knew all of this, she said, before today. Yes. She let that sit. The SUV moved through midtown traffic, pedestrians and yellow cabs, and the ordinary machinery of a Thursday afternoon that had no idea what it had just hosted. Are you going to tell me you didn't intervene today for strategic reasons? She asked. Because I'd rather you didn't. He looked at her. I intervened today because I watched a man gut you in front of your city, and I couldn't sit on the other side of that, he said. The strategy was already in motion. It didn't need today. A pause. Today was personal. She held that. Okay, she said. The estate appeared after 42 minutes, which she counted. She couldn't help it. It sat back from the road behind a stone wall that was not decorative and a gate that opened before the car reached it, which meant someone had been watching. The grounds were large and precise, and the house itself was a gray stone structure that was not designed to charm. It was designed to communicate something, and what it communicated was permanence and the kind of security that wasn't about aesthetics. Inside there were people, staff, but not in the domestic sense. People who moved with the particular economy of motion that suggested training, who acknowledged Nico's return with nods rather than words, who made themselves immediately and deliberately scarce. Nico showed her through the main hall and into a sitting room that was warmer than the exterior suggested. Actual books on the shelves, well used, a fireplace that had been used recently, a desk near the window with papers on it that had not been arranged for her benefit, evidence of a person who lived here. This is the part where you tell me the rest of it, she said, before he could offer her coffee or take her through the formalities of welcome. He stopped. The rest of what? The rest of what I'm in. She sat down without being offered a seat, which felt important. I'm not fragile, Nico. I didn't choose this because I had no other options. I chose it because it was the first clear-eyed decision I'd made in 2 years, and I want to keep making those, which means I need information. He sat across from her, and he talked. He told her about the Serrano operation, not in detail, not in the way that could be used against him, but in the way that a person describes the shape of a thing they've been inside long enough to see its contours. The East Coast organization that bore his name, the territories, the alliances, the specific category of power that politicians courted and publicly disavowed and privately depended on. The enemies, because there were always enemies and they had structure and personnel just as his side did. He told her about the Vero family, who operated out of New Jersey and who had been at uneasy peace with the Serranos for 6 years through a combination of mutual interest and mutual deterrence. He told her about a man named Dominic Vero, the eldest son, who had been patient in the way that ambitious men are patient when they're waiting for an opportunity and manufacturing one when none appeared. And Grayson, Celeste said. Nico's expression didn't change much, but she was learning to read the small things. The slight compression at the corner of his jaw, the shift in how he was holding his hands. Grayson's debt is held by a shell entity that traces back to Dominic Vero, he said. She absorbed this. So Grayson owes money to your enemy. Yes. And today, when the plan didn't work, Grayson becomes a liability to Vero, Nico said, or an asset, depending on how Vero chooses to use him. A man with nothing to lose and access to information about how today happened is useful to someone who wants to know how to move against me. Through me, Celeste said. He looked at her without flinching. Possibly, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. I don't think you're in immediate danger. My security here is... A knock at the door. Not a polite knock. A specific knock. 3 beats, a pause. 2 beats. That Nico responded to by standing immediately. The person who entered was a man somewhere in his mid-30s, lean and dark-haired with the kind of face that was designed to be forgotten, which Celeste suspected was a professional asset. He looked at Nico and then at Celeste with a brief and thorough assessment that he completed in approximately 1 second. "We have a problem," the man said. "Marco," Nico said, which was apparently sufficient introduction. Marco looked at Celeste again. Not unfriendly, but measuring. "She can hear it," Nico said. Marco accepted this without visible reaction. "Varro called 20 minutes ago. He sent condolences on the wedding." He paused. He used that word, condolences. The temperature in the room shifted. "What else?" Nico said. "He knows about the document, the prenup. He knows it didn't execute, which means he knows Grayson's position is compromised." Marco's eyes moved briefly to Celeste again, not unkindly. "He also knows she's here." "How?" "Cathedral had eyes, gray suit, side aisle. We spotted him on the way out, but he was already gone. He was on a call when you arrived." Nico was very still. Celeste thought about the ceremony, about the feeling she'd had, in the periphery of the most significant 17 minutes of her life, of being watched from a specific angle. She'd filed it under paranoia, under the ambient surveillance of 300 people. She understood now that she'd been right to notice it and wrong to dismiss it. "What does Varro want?" Nico asked. "He didn't say specifically." Marco pulled a phone from his inside pocket and set it on the coffee table between them, screen up. On it was a text message, a number Celeste didn't recognize, and the message read, "Tell her she should have left when she had the chance." She looked at it. She looked at it for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, she ran through everything she knew about her own history with fear. The low-grade chronic version she'd carried for years, and the acute version she'd experienced twice today, once at the altar and once in the car. And she came to a conclusion that surprised her with its steadiness. She wasn't afraid. She was something more useful than afraid. "He sent this to your number?" she asked Marco. "To mine," Nico said. His voice had changed. It was quieter and it had an edge in it that she hadn't heard before. Not in the cathedral, not in the car, not in 40 minutes of careful disclosure. This was a different register. The register of someone removing the last layer of management from something they'd been managing. "He's telling me," Nico said, "that he has information about her and that he's prepared to use it." "What information could he have?" Celeste said. "I've been here 4 hours." "He doesn't need information about what you've done," Marco said, not unkindly. "He needs information about who you are, family, business, people you're connected to. Leverage doesn't have to be earned. Sometimes it's just proximity." Her father, the corporation, her mother's quiet life in the apartment on Park Avenue, the things that could be pressed on. "What do we do?" she asked. She asked it to both of them, which she realized a half second after the words were out was a choice about how she was framing herself in this room, and she didn't walk it back. Nico looked at her. "We?" he said. "I'm in this," she said. I walked in, eyes open. Whatever is on the other side of that text message, I'm not going to sit in this room while you handle it in another room. I'm not built like that. He studied her face for a moment. "No," he said, more to himself than to her. "You're not." Marco looked between them. "We need to move on the perimeter, and we need to reach out to the Holloway security team before Varro does. If they don't know there's an active threat to the family, they're vulnerable." "My father won't want to hear that the situation involves Nico Serrano," Celeste said flatly. "Your father is going to have to adjust his preferences," Nico said. "He will," she said. "I just want you to let me be the one to tell him." Nico looked at her with something she still couldn't fully name. Respect was too tidy a word for it. It was more like recognition, the kind that builds rather than the kind that simply identifies. "All right," he said. Marco's phone rang. He looked at it, looked at Nico, and something passed between them that was a full conversation compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact. "Who is it?" Nico said. "It's Grayson Vale," Marco said. The room was very quiet. Celeste felt the air in the room change again, and she understood now that this was how it worked here. Not the sudden dramatic reversals she'd been bracing for since the moment the cathedral doors slammed open, but this. The incremental pressure, the steady accumulation of facts that arranged themselves into a shape that was becoming, with each passing minute, less possible to undo. Grayson was calling Nico's man, which meant Grayson had Nico's man's number, which meant something had been in place before today that she didn't yet have the full map of. She looked at Nico. He was looking at the phone. "Answer it," Celeste said. He looked at her. "Put it on speaker," she said. "I want to hear what he says." Marco looked at Nico. Nico said nothing for 3 seconds that had a specific weight to them. Then he nodded. Marco answered the call and set the phone face up on the table between all three of them, and the sound of Grayson Vale's breathing filled the room before his voice did, and his breathing was the breathing of a man who had spent the past several hours losing altitude very fast, and had just reached the point where the ground was visible. "I need to talk to Serrano," Grayson said. His voice was stripped of everything, the polish, the pleasantness, the calibrated control that he'd maintained through everything, including the microphone, including the altar, including the moment a man whose name emptied rooms had appeared behind him. All of it gone now. What was left was not a man who made calculations. It was just a man. "He's listening," Marco said. A silence. "Varro is going to move on you tonight," Grayson said. "He called me an hour ago. He's been planning this for 3 months. He was waiting for the wedding, for the shift in your attention, the disruption. He has 12 men positioned in—" "Why are you telling me this?" Nico said. His voice was completely flat. "Because he told me what he's going to do to me when he's done with you," Grayson said. "And you'd rather use me as a shield," Nico said. "After sending me a problem. After spending 2 years building a mechanism that was designed to destabilize people I care about." A pause. "You understand why I'm not moved?" "I'm not asking for gratitude," Grayson said, and something in his voice cracked along an edge that sounded real. "I'm telling you that you have approximately 6 hours before he moves. Do what you want with that." The call ended. The room held it. Celeste became aware that her hands were folded in her lap, and she had been pressing them together with a steadiness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the things she'd discovered at the altar, the clean, cold burn of being done with a particular kind of fear. She looked at Nico. He was looking at the phone. Then he looked at her, and she understood from the way he was looking at her, not carefully, not protectively, but directly, as one person to another person who has just been handed a situation that cannot be managed by a single pair of hands, that the next 6 hours were going to determine everything that came after them. "Tell me what you need," she said. Nico Serrano stood up, and whatever remaining distance had existed between the man who had appeared in the cathedral doorway and the man who now occupied this room with her dissolved in the moment before he spoke, because what he said was not a command and not a reassurance and not the speech of a man who was used to people waiting for his decisions. "I need you to call your father," he said, "right now. And I need you to tell him to get your mother out of that apartment before midnight." The word landed in the room, and the room rearranged itself around it. Celeste already had her phone in her hand. She didn't ask why midnight specifically, didn't ask for the full operational picture before she moved, because she understood. In the bone-deep way that you understand things when the situation has burned away everything slow and deliberate, that there were questions for later and actions for now, and this was now. She dialed her father. It rang twice. "Celeste." Edmund's voice was the voice of a man who had been waiting for this call and had rehearsed several versions of what to say during the wait and had still not settled on one. "Listen to me," she said. "Don't talk yet. I need you to get Mom out of the apartment tonight, not tomorrow, tonight, within the hour. Take her to the Westchester house or to Marcus's place or anywhere that isn't Park Avenue, and don't tell anyone where you're going except me." A silence that had texture. "Celeste, what—" "There is a man named Dominic Varro," she said. "His organization is moving against Nico tonight. We believe they may use family as leverage. That means you and Mom are exposed." She kept her voice even. She kept it the way she'd kept it at the altar. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear was a resource and she was allocating it carefully. "I need you to move. I need you to do it now, and I need you to trust me." Another silence. Shorter this time. "How certain are you?" Edmund said. "Certain enough that I'm telling you instead of waiting to be wrong." She heard him exhale, a long, controlled breath, that was the closest her father came to visible distress. "All right," he said. "We'll move. Call me when you're out." She ended the call and looked up. Nico was watching her from across the room. Marco had moved to the door, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, rapid sentences to someone she couldn't identify. Two other men had appeared from somewhere. She hadn't seen them enter, which told her the estate had a geometry she hadn't fully mapped yet. Entry points and corridors that existed for purposes the main rooms didn't advertise. "Done," she said. "Good." Nico moved to the desk and opened the top drawer and removed a handgun with the casual efficiency of a man retrieving a set of keys. He checked it. A brief, practiced movement, the magazine, the chamber, and set it on the desk within reach. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't look at her while he did it to gauge her reaction. He simply did it the way you prepare the tools you might need and moved on. She noted this, filed it. "What do you need from me for the next 6 hours?" she asked. He looked at her. "Honestly, that's the only way I'm asking. I need you to stay in this room," he said, "not because I think you can't handle what's outside it, because this room is the most defensible space in the house, and I need to know where you are every minute." He held her gaze. "I can't do what needs to be done out there if I'm dividing my attention in here. Do you understand the difference?" She did. She understood it as a professional reality rather than a protective impulse, which made it possible to accept. "I understand," she said, "but I want information as it comes in. I'm not sitting in a room with a closed door while things happen on the other side of it." "Marco will stay with you," Nico said. "He'll tell you what I can tell you when I can tell you it. And the rest? The rest you'll see when it's over." She nodded. He picked up the gun from the desk. He looked at her one more time. That look she was beginning to know, the one that was not soft and not hard, but something specifically itself. And then he left the room, and the door didn't quite close behind him, which she understood was intentional. Marco finished his call and came to stand near the window. He was 3 feet from her, and he was scanning the grounds through the glass with the systematic attention of a man who did this the way other men breathed. The next 2 hours moved the way dangerous time moves, in stretches of nothing punctuated by moments of concentrated intensity that left residue. Marco's phone rang 4 times. He answered each call in the same low register, said very little, listened with his whole body. Each time he finished a call, he gave her a sentence of information. Teams in position, the east gate secured, a vehicle flagged on the perimeter road and investigated and identified as a resident's delivery. And she stored each sentence alongside the others and built a picture from them. At 9:47, her father called to tell her he and her mother were at Marcus's place in Greenwich. His voice was different from the call before. The controlled executive tone had thinned slightly at the edges. Not from fear, but from the particular discomfort of a man who has been moved by circumstances rather than moving them. She told him she'd be in touch, and didn't give him time to ask the questions she could hear forming. At 10:15, Nico came back. He came through the door with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was something different in the way he carried himself. Not more tense, but more compressed, everything pulled inward and focused. He went directly to the desk and picked up a folder that Marco had placed there during one of his corridor appearances and opened it and read the first page standing up. "Grayson's information was accurate," he said, without looking up. 12 men. They're staging from a warehouse in Yonkers." He turned a page. "Varro himself is not in the field. He's in the city." He turned another page and stopped. Something in the quality of his stillness changed. Marco saw it too. He moved away from the window. "What?" Celeste said. Nico closed the folder. He set it down on the desk and pressed his palm flat against it, and he stood like that for a moment, which was long enough for her to understand that what was in that folder was not an operational update about 12 men in Yonkers. What was in that folder was something else, something that required a different kind of processing. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her. "My man on the inside," he said. "The one who's been feeding us Varro's movements for the past 8 months. He stopped. His jaw moved once, the way someone's jaw moves when they're deciding how to shape what comes next. "His name is Sal Renner. He's been with me for 6 years. She waited. "He's in that warehouse," Nico said. "Not as a prisoner." The room took that in. Marco said something very quietly in a language she didn't recognize. Not a curse, something shorter and more final than a curse. He's been running information to Varro, Nico said, for, according to what my team pulled in the last hour, for approximately 4 months, since February. He picked up the folder and set it down again, a small gesture that was the closest thing to visible agitation she'd seen from him. He knew about the wedding. He knew about the prenup strategy. He knew that Grayson's debt traced back to Varro. He looked at Celeste and she saw something in his face that she hadn't expected, and that hit her harder than she'd have predicted. It was not anger. It was the specific devastation of someone who has just been shown that a person they trusted with their life chose, deliberately, to use that trust as a weapon. He's been feeding them everything for 4 months. The silence was complete. Then Celeste thought of something. The community center, she said. Nico looked at her. 4 years ago, she said carefully, when I made the anonymous donation, how did Varro know I was going to be in that cathedral today? How did he know about me at all? Like, not just that Grayson was pursuing me, but specifically about me, specifically enough to send that text. She held his gaze. How did he know the donation was anonymous? How does anyone know what the donation was unless someone told them who you were watching and why? The silence changed texture. Marco turned from the window. Nico looked at her with the expression of a man who has just seen something arrive from a direction he wasn't watching, and it was not a comfortable expression because it contained within it the beginning of a very dark piece of arithmetic. Sal has been with me for 6 years, Nico said slowly. He was in position when the community center situation happened. He knew I was following it. A pause. He would have known why. So Varro has known about me for 4 months, Celeste said. He's known that you had a, she chose her word carefully, a personal interest. He's known that if something happened to me or with me, it would be a point of leverage. Yes, Nico said. And today was designed, she said, not just Grayson's piece of it, all of it. Grayson was already Varro's debt holder. Varro knew the wedding was happening. He let it happen, let the humiliation happen, let the whole public spectacle happen. Because he knew you'd respond. Because he knew bringing you out into the open, attaching your name publicly to mine, would give him a target, Nico said. A fixed point. Me in a house with 1 woman I actually give a damn about, and 12 men in a warehouse 6 miles away. He said it with the flat precision of a man reading his own post-mortem. I walked into it. We both did, she said. He looked at her. This doesn't change the outcome, she said. It changes the map. But we're still here, and they're still 6 miles away, and you have... She looked at Marco. How many men on the grounds? 14, Marco said, plus 6 in secondary positions off-site. So it's not 12-1, she said. It's 20-12, with home ground advantage. She looked at Nico. That's not a catastrophe, that's a fight. Something moved across Nico's face. You're remarkably calm, he said. I'm terrified, she said. But I've been managing terror since this morning, and I've gotten efficient at it. Marco's phone went off. He looked at it, and his face did the thing she'd learned to watch for. The small contraction of attention that meant the information was significant. They're moving, he said. Early. They're not waiting until midnight. Nico was already turning. How long? He said. 20 minutes, maybe less. The room converted instantly. The 2 men who'd been positioned near the rear corridor were suddenly visible again, and Marco was speaking into his earpiece in rapid, short commands, and Nico had the gun from the desk and was moving with the compressed purposefulness of someone for whom this was not the first time and would not, if everything went right, be the last. He stopped at the door. He looked at Celeste. There's a room at the end of this corridor, he said. Steel door. It locks from the inside. I need you. I heard you the first time, she said. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Marco stays with you, he said. Go, she said. He went. The sounds of the estate changed. She could feel it rather than hear it. A shift in the vibrational quality of the building, the specific aliveness of a structure that has deployed all of its defensive capacity. Footsteps she couldn't track, voices too low to parse, then a period of silence that was worse than noise. Marco was at the window again. They'll come through the north perimeter first, he said, not to her, but not to her. It's the weakest approach. Vero's people will know that, which means Nico's people know that too. You've run scenarios, she said. We run scenarios every week, he said. This is what we do. She stood and went to stand beside him at the window. The grounds were dark, the formal landscaping reduced to shapes in the ambient light from the exterior fixtures. She couldn't see any of Nico's men. She understood this was intentional. Tell me about Sal, she said. Marco looked at her sideways. Why? But because I want to understand the shape of the betrayal, she said. I want to know whether he did it for money, or whether someone got to someone he loved, or whether he simply decided to. She looked at the dark grounds. The reason matters, not for sympathy, for what it means about who else might be in the same position. Marco was quiet for a moment. Sal has a daughter, he said. She's sick, has been for about a year. The treatment costs... He stopped. A lot. She absorbed this. So someone approached him, she said, when he was desperate. That's my read, Marco said. Doesn't excuse it. No, she agreed. It doesn't excuse it. The first sound came 7 minutes later. Not gunfire, something before gunfire. The particular percussion of a confrontation at a perimeter, bodies and equipment, and the short, ugly sounds of men running into organized resistance in the dark. Then the gunfire started, and it was nothing like the movies. It was sharp and irregular and directional, sound that had sources she couldn't place and couldn't predict, and her entire nervous system wanted to do something with the adrenaline that was flooding it, and the only option available was to stand still and breathe and count. She counted. Marco had moved from the window to the door, positioning himself with his back to the frame and his hand inside his jacket. His earpiece delivered a steady stream of information she could hear only partially. Fragments, call signs, position updates that meant nothing without the map they referenced. His face remained neutral, and she read what she could from the micro-adjustments. A slight release of tension when something went right, a tightening around the eyes when it didn't. 4 minutes into it, he turned to her. North perimeter is holding, he said. Eastgate took 2 men down. Nico's people are pushing them back. She nodded. What about Sal? She asked. What about him? Is he in the field with the 12 men? Last report had him at the warehouse. So he's not here, she said. He's waiting to see how it goes. That's consistent with how Vero uses information assets, Marco said. Keep them back, keep them clean. She thought about this. She thought about a man who had been trusted for 6 years, who had eaten at tables she could imagine without having sat at them, who had been in rooms where real things were decided, who had been given proximity to someone that most of the world would have paid significantly for, and who had sold that proximity for a sick child's medical bills, which was the kind of reason that made you hate the entire structure of a world that produced such impossible choices, but which still left you with a betrayal that had to be answered. She thought about what Nico's face had looked like when he read that folder. She thought about the look she'd seen in the cathedral, the first time, the look that had seen her. 6 years of trust, and someone had decided to use the thing Nico cared about as a delivery mechanism for destruction. Not the organization, not the territory. Him, the specific him that existed underneath the name and the suit and the reputation. Something hardened in her chest that she recognized from the altar. The same cold clarity, the same willingness to be done with a particular species of grief. The gunfire outside tapered, became sporadic, then stopped. The silence that followed was the dense kind, not empty, but full of held breath and aftermath. Marco's earpiece spoke. His face shifted. Not relief, something more complicated than relief. It's over, he said. Varro's men are down or running. Nico's... He stopped. A new voice in his ear. He listened for 4 seconds, and she watched his face do a thing she hadn't seen it do before. A sharp intake, quickly controlled. Copy, he said. He looked at her. Nico's hit, he said. The word hit arrived in her chest before the information it carried did, and for a moment she was just standing in its impact zone, processing the purely physical fact of it the way you process a very loud sound. How bad? She said. He's standing, Marco said. Left side. He's asking for you. She was at the door before the sentence was finished, and Marco was with her, and they moved through the corridor and out through the rear of the main hall into the cold night air where the grounds smelled like discharge and churned earth, and the particular sharp metal quality that she'd only ever read about and understood now was real. Nico was near the north wall. He was standing, which she held on to. He was standing, and he had his hand pressed to his left side, and the jacket was dark in a way that jackets don't get in the dark unless the dark is wet, and the man beside him was applying pressure with a competence that suggested medical training rather than improvisation. He looked up when she came through the garden. "I told you I was fine," he said, to her or to Marco or to the general category of people who came running when they shouldn't. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's not deep," he said. She came and stood in front of him and looked at his face, which was tight with managed pain and had a quality in it, in the eyes, in the set of the jaw, that she was learning to read as the cost of things. The specific gravity of a man who had just spent 6 hours in a kind of tension that had weight, actual weight, and who was paying for it now in the currency of adrenaline come down and a wound in his left side and the knowledge of a betrayal that hadn't finished being known yet. She put her hand over his, where he was pressing against his side. He looked at it. "The doctor is 4 minutes out," the man beside him said. "It can wait," Nico said. "It can't," Celeste said. He looked at her. "Sal Renner is still in Yonkers," she said, "alive, waiting." "I know," Nico said. "What are you going to do about it?" He was quiet for a moment. The night around them was settling into its aftermath sounds, distant sirens, the domestic sounds of a large property in reorientation, someone giving quiet instructions somewhere to her left. "What I have to do," he said. "I want to be there," she said. He looked at her with the look she'd first seen across 300 feet of cathedral floor. Direct, complete, without apology. But there was something new in it now, something that had been earned in the past 6 hours in ways she could feel rather than articulate. "Celeste," he said. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I know what it means. I know what that room is going to look like and what you're going to have to do in it, and I know it's not—" She stopped. Chose her words the way she'd chosen her voice at the altar, the way she'd chosen her answer when he asked her in front of 300 people. "I know it's not the world I come from, but I'm not in that world anymore. I made that choice today, and I knew what I was choosing." She held his gaze. Don't protect me from the thing I already chose." Something in his face that she would spend a long time thinking about later. A kind of opening, a quality of being seen in return. Then Marco's phone rang. Not Marco's personal phone, the one he'd put on the coffee table 2 hours ago, the one that Grayson had called. They all looked at it. Marco answered it and held it out. And the voice that came through the speaker was not Grayson's. It was a voice she hadn't heard before. Smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had received news in the past few minutes and was not particularly disturbed by it, which told her everything she needed to know about how Dominic Vero related to the 12 men who had just failed in her husband's garden. "Serrano," the voice said. "I hear congratulations are in order." Nico took the phone. "Varo," he said. "I wanted to extend my personal apologies for the unpleasantness this evening," Varo said. The smoothness of it was extraordinary. A man discussing a minor social inconvenience. "Some of my associates acted without my full authorization. You understand how these things go." "I understand exactly how they go," Nico said. "I also wanted to speak with your wife," Vero said. The word wife in his mouth was a specific instrument. Nico looked at Celeste. She held out her hand for the phone. He gave it to her. She raised it to her ear. "Mr. Vero," she said. "Mrs. Serrano." A pause that was not a pause. It was a calibration. "I've been curious about you since February. You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" she said. "Someone easier," he said pleasantly. "Someone who would complicate things without meaning to. A liability in a dress." Another pause. "Instead, I find someone who helped move her own parents to safety, who asked the right questions about Sal Renner, and who is currently standing in a night garden with her hand on her husband's wound." A pause. "That's a particular kind of woman." Her blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the night air. He had eyes on the grounds. "Right now." She looked at the darkness beyond the north wall, and the darkness looked exactly like darkness, and contained, somewhere in it, someone who had been watching long enough to see her put her hand over Nico's. "Here is what I want you to understand," Vero said, and the pleasantness dropped by a single register, not threatening, just exact. Tonight was a test, not of Serrano's security. I know what that is. A test of you, of what you're made of whether you are, in fact, the complication I suspected you would be. A pause. You are. I'll take that as a compliment, she said. You should, he said. It's the last one I'll be offering. His voice settled into something that had the quality of a door closing. Tell your husband that Sal is no longer in Yonkers. He left 20 minutes ago. And the information he took with him when he left. I'm listening, Celeste said. Includes the location of the account that funds the Meridian Community Foundation, Varro said. The one your anonymous donation came from 4 years ago. The one that, if examined carefully, traces back to a Holloway subsidiary that has some regulatory questions outstanding. A pause that had precision in it. Your father's corporation, Mrs. Serrano, and your name on the foundation documents, which were never entirely anonymous. Another pause. I'm going to give you 48 hours to convince your husband to come to a table. Conversation, nothing more. The smoothness was absolute. If he doesn't, I release the documentation to 3 separate regulatory agencies and 2 financial journalists who have been looking for exactly this kind of thread to pull on the Holloway Corporation for a very long time. Celeste stood in the night garden with her husband's blood on her hand and the phone at her ear, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical in its specificity, that the world she had walked away from this morning at the altar had just reached back and wrapped its hand around her ankle. She had saved a community center. She had done it anonymously. She had done it with money that was hers, that she'd believed was clean, that had come from an account she'd established years ago, through a subsidiary that she hadn't examined closely enough, because she'd trusted the structure, and the structure had been built by people who didn't build clean things. And someone had been sitting on that information for 4 months, waiting for the precise moment when it would do the most damage. The word had nowhere to go. Celeste stood in the garden with the phone at her ear and the night pressing in from all sides, and she finished the sentence in her own head the way you finish sentences that have been deliberately cut short. Because Varro had done it intentionally, she understood that, had ended the call at the precise moment of maximum impact, leaving her holding a live wire in the dark. She lowered the phone. Nico was watching her face. He was still pressing his left side with his own hand, the doctor not yet arrived, the wound doing what wounds do when they're not catastrophic, bleeding steadily, insisting on being acknowledged without being immediately fatal. He was reading her face the way she'd learned to read his, in the compressed language of small things. Tell me, he said. She told him. All of it. The foundation account, the Holloway subsidiary, the regulatory exposure, the 48 hours. She delivered it in the same flat sequence she'd received it. No editorializing, no hedging, watching his face as each piece arrived and registered. His expression didn't change dramatically, but she could see the weight accumulating behind his eyes, the specific gravity of a man absorbing the full shape of something he'd been only partially seeing. When she finished, he was quiet. Marco stood 3 feet away with his hands at his sides, and the particular stillness of a man who understands that this is not his moment to fill. He's had this for 4 months, Nico said finally. Yes. And he waited for the wedding. Yes. He looked at the north wall. Beyond it, somewhere in the dark, someone was watching with enough detail to describe the position of her hand on his side. He looked at the dark the way you look at something you're about to do something about. There's an eye on the grounds, she said. He described us. He could see us. I know. Nico looked at the man who'd been applying pressure to his side. Find it. The man moved without a word. The doctor arrived 6 minutes later. A compact woman in her 50s who came through the rear gate with a bag and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had treated injuries in contexts that didn't invite questions. She looked at Nico's side, said 2 words to him, and began working with an efficiency that Celeste watched carefully because watching something concrete was better than standing inside the 48 hours. The wound was not deep. This was confirmed without ceremony. A graze, the doctor said. The bullet had taken a clean path across the oblique muscle without penetrating the cavity. It needed cleaning, closure, monitoring. Not a hospital. Not yet. Nico sat through the treatment on a garden bench, upright, while the doctor worked by flashlight. and he looked at Celeste the entire time with an expression that she was reading now, as the expression he had when he was thinking through something that had multiple moving parts, and none of them were moving the direction he wanted. "My father's corporation," she said. She wasn't asking. She was thinking out loud, which was something she did at whiteboards and in budget meetings, and apparently now in night gardens while her husband got stitched up. "Varro doesn't actually want to destroy it." Nico looked at her. "If he releases the documentation, it starts a process he can't control," she continued. "Regulatory agencies, journalists. Once that's in motion, it creates exposure for everyone connected to the Holloway Corporation, including the subsidiaries, including the accounts that fund things." She let that develop. "Including whatever Varro himself has laundered through legitimate business structures in the past 6 years. The doctor pressed a dressing to Nico's side. He didn't flinch. "He's using it as a lever," Celeste said. "Not a bomb. He doesn't want to detonate it. He wants to hold it." "That's correct," Nico said. "So what he actually wants from the table conversation," she said, "is not a truce. It's a structure, something that gives him ongoing leverage. An arrangement." She looked at him. "He wants to own part of what we are." "Yes," Nico said. "And if you go to that table—" "I sit across from him and I negotiate from a position of debt," he said. "Whatever terms come out of that table, he controls them, because he controls what's underneath the table." She stood in the cold and worked through it. "Then we don't go to the table," she said. "No," he agreed. "We don't." "Which means 48 hours. Less now, 44. The doctor finished, snapped her bag closed, gave Nico a set of instructions in the tone of a woman who knew they would be partially followed, and left the way she'd come in. Nico stood. He moved carefully, not slowly, but with the particular deliberateness of someone managing a new variable in their body's equation. He buttoned his shirt over the dressing and looked at Marco. "Get everyone inside," he said. "Full briefing in 20 minutes. Then he looked at Celeste. "Including you." She followed him in. The briefing room was not the sitting room. It was a room she hadn't seen yet. Windowless, accessed through a door behind the bookshelf in the study, which was the kind of architectural detail that would have surprised her 12 hours ago and didn't now. There was a table, 8 chairs, a wall display that Marco activated from a panel near the door, and 7 men who had the look of men who had just been in a fight and had not yet had the space to feel it. A cut above one man's eye. Another with his left arm held slightly away from his body. All of them with the specific residue of an hour in the dark, doing things that left residue. They looked at Celeste when she entered. Not hostility. Assessment. The thorough, rapid kind. Nico sat at the head of the table and she took the chair to his right without being directed, and none of the 7 men said anything about it. "Sal Renner left the warehouse 20 minutes before our team arrived," Nico said without preamble. "He has 4 months of detailed intelligence on our operations, our positions, and our financial exposure. He's with Varro now or moving toward him." He looked at each person at the table in turn. "I need him found. Not confronted. Found and located. I need to know where Varro is holding him and whether he's there willingly." "He went willingly," one of the men said. Young, sharp-faced, a bruise forming at his jaw that hadn't been there an hour ago. "You sound certain," Nico said. "He called Varro when we were moving on the warehouse," the man said. "One of our guys heard the call. He said," I'm quoting, he said, "It worked. I'm coming in." The table absorbed this. Celeste looked at her hands on the tabletop. Clean now. She'd washed them at the garden spigot, the cold water and her own methodical scrubbing, the blood running pink and then clear. Clean hands, dirty situation. "He wanted out," she said. Everyone looked at her. "He wanted out, and this was his exit," she said. "He didn't just need money for his daughter's treatment, he needed a way to leave. And Varro gave him both." She looked at Nico. "Which means he's an asset Varro will protect. Which means wherever he is, it's not somewhere we can reach without cost." "What are you saying?" Marco asked. "I'm saying don't chase Sal," she said. "He's already gone. Whatever he took with him has already been delivered. Going after him now gives Varro a reason to accelerate, and we need the 44 hours more than we need Sal Renner." A silence at the table. Nico looked at her. "She's right," he said. "Sal is done. We move to the clock." He put both hands flat on the table. "Varro's leverage is the Holloway documentation. We have 44 hours to neutralize it before he files. That means two things. We find what he has, and we find it before his lawyers do anything with it. And we deal with the subsidiary exposure so that when it comes out, because it will come out, there is nothing actionable in it. He looked at a man at the far end of the table. Felix. The man called Felix was older than the others. 60s, gray-haired, with the look of an accountant who had seen things accountants were not supposed to see. I'll need access to the Holloway books, he said. You'll have it, Celeste said. She looked at Felix directly. And I'll need to be in the room. Felix looked at Nico. Nico nodded. I'll need my father's cooperation, she said. He's not going to want to give access to... She gestured carefully at the room and its occupants. He'll need to be convinced. Can you convince him? Nico asked. I convinced him to move my mother in under an hour, she said. I can do it again. 20 minutes later, she was in the study with her phone, and the conversation with Edmund Holloway was the hardest conversation she'd had in a day that had contained several very hard conversations. He said things she expected, and things she didn't. He said things that were about the corporation, and things that were almost, in the oblique and unpracticed language of a man like her father, about her. She gave him 45 minutes of compressed honesty, the subsidiary, the foundation account, what she knew and how she knew it. And at the end of it, she heard him do the thing she'd heard him do twice in her life, make a decision by going very quiet and then asking a single logistical question. Felix Renard, he said. You know him, she said. By reputation, her father said. Yes. All right. She sat in the study until 2 in the morning while Felix worked in the room next door with 3 laptops and the particular intense silence of a man deconstructing something at speed. Nico was in and out, managing the perimeter reset, 2 phone calls she wasn't present for, a 3rd call she was, and each time he passed through the study he moved carefully, the wound in his side present in the slight adjustment of his gait. And each time she looked at him, looking at her, she was aware of the accumulation of hours between them, the specific weight of having been through something with a person. At 2:47, Felix appeared in the study doorway. I found it, he said. The subsidiary in question was a holding vehicle that had been established 11 years ago by Edmund Holloway's predecessor, CFO, a man who had retired before Celeste's involvement in the corporation and who had structured the entity in a way that was technically legal at the time of formation and had become progressively less so as the regulatory landscape shifted. The foundation account had been funded from it once, 4 years ago, the anonymous donation, and the account had been dormant since. It was not, Felix explained with the care of a man who had spent 40 years in financial architecture, catastrophic. But it was exposed. If someone who understood where to look and what to ask presented it to the right regulatory body with the right framing, it would require a response that would take 18 months and significant legal expenditure and would generate the kind of press that made institutional investors nervous. Can you clean it? Celeste asked. In 44 hours? Felix said. 42 now. He looked at the ceiling. I can restructure the entity and establish a documented remediation timeline that preempts any regulatory finding. It won't be invisible, but it will be managed. The story changes from concealed violation to identified and addressed structural irregularity. He paused. But if Vero files before I finish, he won't, Nico said from the doorway. Both of them looked at him. He came into the room with his jacket back on, the slight stiffness at his left side visible if you knew to look for it, and his face had the quality she'd seen at 2 in the morning when the last piece of a thing had finally arrived. Vero doesn't have the documentation, he said. Silence. He has the knowledge of it, Nico said. The account numbers, the structure, enough to describe it credibly. But the actual documents, the filing ready package, is with Sal. And Sal doesn't have it yet either. He was supposed to retrieve it tonight, from a storage location in Lower Manhattan. He looked at Marco. He didn't get there, because we moved his timeline and he had to run. Celeste felt the architecture of it shift. Where's the storage location? She said. Avenue B, Nico said, a law office that does work for several of Vero's entities. The package is in their secure file system. How do you know this? Marco asked. Because the eye on the grounds, Nico said, was not a Vero man. It was ours. A pause. I put him there 6 weeks ago when I started to believe we had a leak. He's been watching Who Watches Us. He looked at Celeste with something in his face that was both apology and explanation. I knew about the storage location for 3 hours. I didn't tell you because I needed to watch how the call with Vero changed our room first. She understood this. She didn't love it, but she understood it. You were watching me, she said, during the call. I was watching the room, he said. You happened to be the most important thing in it. She held that. The law office, she said. Avenue B. How long to get there and pull the file? It's not a walk-in situation, Marco said. No, Nico said. It'll require... His phone rang. Not his personal phone. The dedicated line, the one that only a specific category of people had the number for, the one that had been silent all night in a way that had itself been a kind of information. He looked at the screen. Grayson Vale. The room went still. Celeste looked at the name on the screen and felt the specific nausea of something she'd thought was handled coming back animated and upright and calling from a number she'd almost forgotten existed. Nico answered. I'm at the law office, Grayson said. His voice was different from the warehouse call. Not stripped down this time, but compressed, tight. The voice of a man who has made a decision and is moving through it before he can think himself out of it. Avenue B. Vero's file storage. A sound in the background hit. An interior sound. A building at night. I'm inside. Nico's jaw moved once. How? He said. I've been doing due diligence on Vero's entities for 3 months, Grayson said. He wanted me to understand the structure. He trusted me with access. A short pause. He shouldn't have. What do you want, Grayson? Nico said. I want to pull the file and bring it to you, Grayson said. The complete package, everything Sal was supposed to retrieve tonight. In exchange, no, Celeste said. Both men in the room looked at her. She hadn't realized she'd said it out loud. She looked at the phone in Nico's hand. No deals, she said. Whatever you're about to offer, no. A silence on the line. Celeste, Grayson said, and her name in his mouth was a different thing now. Not the management tool it had been for 2 years. Not the instrument of calibrated warmth. It was just a word, just her name. I'm not doing this for a deal. Then why? She said. Because Vero told me what he's planning to do with your family if Serrano doesn't come to the table, Grayson said. And a stop, a breath. I know I don't have the right to fix anything. I know that, but I can do this. She looked at Nico. He was looking at her, giving her the call, giving her the decision, which she understood was not a small thing. She took the phone. Pull the file, she said. Bring it out. After that, whatever happens to you is between you and your own choices. We won't touch you. We won't help you. She paused. But we won't come after you either. That's all I'm offering. A long silence. Okay, Grayson said. The line went quiet, but didn't end. He'd put the phone in his pocket. She could hear the muffled sounds of movement. A man navigating a building in the dark. And the 6 people in the study stood around Nico's phone, listening to the sounds of Grayson Vale trying to do the first unambiguously decent thing he'd done in longer than she'd known him. Then a different sound. A door. Not Grayson's movement. Something else, external, the sound of entry. Then Grayson's voice, close to the phone, dropping to almost nothing. Someone's here. Nico was on his feet. Get out, he said, loud enough for the phone to carry it. Leave the file if you have to. Get out of the building. I have it, Grayson breathed. I have it. I just need to get to the... A sound that was a body making contact with something solid. Then another voice on the line. Male, unhurried, with the particular smoothness she'd heard once before tonight through a phone pressed against her ear in a dark garden. Dominic Varro. Mr. Serrano, he said. I expected you'd find the storage location eventually. I didn't expect you'd send your wife's former fiancé to retrieve the materials. A pause. That's almost elegant. Another pause, and in it she heard Grayson make a sound that was not a word. I have Mr. Vale. He's unharmed. He'll remain that way as long as you come to me directly, not your people, not Marco Diaz. A very specific pause. You and your wife. The line went dead. The study was absolutely silent. Celeste felt the situation calcify around her, all the moving pieces locking into a configuration that had only one opening in it, and the opening required her body in it, her presence, her willingness to walk into a room where the most dangerous man in the conversation was holding the last remaining leverage over everything she'd spent the past 14 hours trying to protect. She looked at Nico. He was already looking at her, and his face was doing the thing where everything was compressed inward and present, and there was nothing behind his eyes that was elsewhere. No part of his attention on anything that wasn't this room and this moment and her. "No," he said. "He said both of us," she said. "I heard what he said." "Then you heard that going without me isn't an option," she said. "If you go alone, he has no reason to keep Grayson alive and every reason to set a trap that 12 men didn't accomplish." She held his gaze without flinching. "He wants me in the room because he thinks I'm the soft point. He thinks I'll make you manageable." "You might," Nico said. Something raw in that. Something that cost him. "I won't," she said. "But he needs to believe I will. Long enough to get us into the room." "Celeste?" "Nico." She said his name the way he'd said hers in the cathedral, quiet enough to be only for him. "I told you this morning that I was done making decisions based on fear. I meant it then. I mean it now." She watched him work through it. She watched the conflict move across his face in the way that strong people's conflicts move. Not visible in obvious ways, but in the compression of things. The specific cost of a man trying to protect someone he chose, and being shown that the choosing goes both directions. "You do exactly what I tell you," he said, "the moment we're in that room." "Agreed," she said, "with one condition." He waited. "When we get Grayson out," she said, "whatever happens to Vero, I'm not leaving the room before it's finished." His eyes on hers. Outside, Marco was already pulling cars around. She could hear the engine, the specific low sound of a large vehicle on gravel, the muted efficiency of men who had been told to move and were moving. Nico stood and buttoned his jacket over the wound that the doctor had closed an hour ago, and that was going to hurt for the next several weeks in ways that a bandage wouldn't cover. And he looked at her across the study with the same look he'd had in the cathedral. Direct, complete, without apology. And underneath all of it, the specific quality of a man who has found something he didn't expect to find and is now confronted with the full weight of what it means to protect it. "Stay to my left," he said. "Whatever happens when we get in there, don't get between me and Vero. And if I tell you to move, you move. No debate." "No debate," she agreed. He offered her his right hand, not as a gesture, not as a comfort, as information. A point of contact in a dark that was about to get darker. She took it. And they walked toward the door together, into the part of the night that hadn't finished being dark yet. The car moved through Manhattan at 3 in the morning the way the city allowed at that hour. Unobstructed, direct. The grid stripped of its daytime resistance. Celeste sat in the back with Nico's hand still in hers and watched the streets through tinted glass and did not speak. And neither did he, because there was a category of preparation that happened in silence and required it, and they were both inside it. Marco drove. One other man in the front passenger seat. She'd learned his name was Dex, short for something she hadn't asked about. 2 cars behind them, Nico's people in separate vehicles that would position outside the building and not enter unless called. This had been the negotiation before they left the estate, conducted in the driveway in 2 minutes of rapid, low exchange that she'd listened to and not interfered with. Nico knew the geometry of these things. She understood her role in that geometry. Not passive, but specific. A particular kind of presence in a particular kind of room. She thought about what she knew of Dominic Vero, a voice on the phone. Smooth and unhurried. A man who thought in structures, in leverage points, in arrangements that sustained themselves. A man who had spent 6 years in careful equilibrium with Nico Serrano and had decided at some point in the past several months that the equilibrium was costing more than the disruption. Who had built a mechanism, Grayson, Sal, the documentation, the wedding, that was elegant in its construction and had failed at its most critical point because a woman in a corset had picked up her drop bouquet and refused to cry. She thought about Grayson. She'd had 14 hours to feel things about Grayson Vale, and she'd allocated them carefully because feeling things in the full volume they deserved required space she hadn't had. What she found when she looked at it honestly was not what she'd expected. Not hatred, or not only hatred, something more complicated. The particular grief of someone who has to admit that the person who hurt them was never a mystery. That the signs were present. That she'd chosen, repeatedly and with full access to her own perception, not to read them. She'd loved him the way people love projections, carefully, with their eyes on the version that could exist rather than the one that did. And he'd let her, because the projection was useful to him, and because he was, she suspected now, sufficiently hollow that the projection had been company of a kind. That was over. What was not over was a man in a building on Avenue B who had gone in there for reasons she couldn't fully account for and was now sitting across from the smoothest voice she'd heard all day, and she was 20 minutes away from the building. "He's not going to hurt Grayson," she said. "Not a question. Working it out." Nico looked at her. "Not yet," he said. "Grayson isn't the point. We are." "He wants the meeting," she said. "The table. He's been trying to get you to the table all night through indirect means, and none of them worked. So now he's using direct means. Grayson is the hook." "Yes." "Which means when we get there, he's going to want to negotiate." "He's going to try," Nico said. She looked at him. "What happens instead?" He held her gaze for a moment. "Varro has been running a particular kind of operation for a long time. One that depends on the perception that he can't be touched. The 6-year equilibrium with me. It was never peace. It was him and his people believing that the cost of coming at me was higher than the benefit." He paused. Tonight changed that calculation. Not because his 12 men failed, because he revealed the mechanism. He showed me Sal. He showed me the documentation strategy. He put all of it on the table to make me compliant. His jaw tightened. A man who does that from strength doesn't do it. He does it because he's running out of patience, which means he's running out of something else. "Money," she said. "Time," he said. "The Varro operation has been contracting for 2 years. Territory, alliances, revenue streams. He needed a structural win. He needed to bring me to a table where the terms were his, and tonight was supposed to deliver that." He looked out the window at the moving city. It didn't. "So when we walk into that room," she said, "we're walking in to show him that. We're walking in to end it," he said. The building on Avenue B was a 4-story brownstone that wore its law office identity on the first floor. Brass nameplate, buzzer panel, the generic respectability of a professional address that did not advertise its secondary functions. The block was quiet. 3 in the morning quiet. The specific urban silence of a street that has finished its day and not started its next one. Marco pulled to the curb. Nico looked at the building, then at her. "Ready," she said, before he asked. They went in. The front door was unlocked, which meant someone had unlocked it for them, which meant Varro had eyes on the street and had seen them coming and had made the calculation that letting them enter was preferable to having them enter anyway through a less cooperative door. The hallway was dim, a single fixture at the ceiling, the commercial carpet of a space that had never been designed for comfort. A staircase to the right. A door at the end of the hall, closed, with light coming under it. The light under the door. Nico moved to it with his hand at his side, not reaching for the weapon but within reach of it, and she stayed to his left as instructed, close enough that their arms were almost touching. She could hear his breathing, measured, controlled, the breathing of someone who had decided exactly how much of themselves to spend on this, and was pacing accordingly. She matched it without thinking about it. The door opened before they reached it. The man who opened it was large and expressionless, the specific expressionlessness of professional function, and he looked at both of them and stepped back. The room was a conference room. A long table, 8 chairs, a credenza against one wall with the detritus of working hours, coffee equipment, stacked files, the neutral ugliness of a space designed for transactions rather than experience. The overhead lights were on fully, which was a choice. Bright rooms were for people who had nothing to hide in them. Grayson Vale was in a chair at the far end of the table, to the right. He was upright, unhurt as advertised, though the upright quality had a tension in it that came from his hands being secured behind the chair with something she couldn't see from this angle. He looked at Celeste when she entered, and his face did something she hadn't expected. Not relief at her presence, not calculation, but something that was simply and uncomplicatedly ashamed. He looked away. Dominic Varro was standing at the window. He was smaller than she'd constructed him in her head, which she recognized as a failure of imagination on her part. Dangerous men in her experience tended toward the understated. He was 60 or near it, silver-haired, the build of a man who had been athletic once and had settled into something denser. He wore a dark suit that was expensive and not showy, and his face had the arranged quality of someone who had spent decades deciding precisely what expression to wear in precisely which rooms. He looked at Celeste first. Not Nico. Her. She held the look without adjusting herself. "Mrs. Serrano," he said. The same voice. In person it had the same smoothness, but now she could hear what lived under it, a quality of controlled effort. The smoothness was maintained, not natural. That was useful to know. "Mr. Vero," she said. He looked at Nico. Something moved between them. Not a greeting, not hostility, something older than both of those. The specific mutual recognition of two people who have occupied the same landscape for long enough to know each other's weight without ever being in the same room. "Sit down," Vero said. "No," Nico said. A pause. "It's a conversation," Vero said. "Then we'll have it standing," Nico said. "Let him go." A slight indication of Grayson. "When we've finished." "Now," Nico said. "He's not relevant to what happens in this room. You kept him to get us here. We're here." Vero considered this with the particular visible deliberateness of a man who wanted to be seen considering things. Then he looked at the large man near the door and made a small motion with two fingers. The large man went to Grayson's chair and did something behind it, and Grayson's hands came free, and he stood and rolled his wrists and looked at the floor. "The door's behind you," Celeste said to him. She didn't look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on Vero. Grayson walked to the door. He stopped in the doorway. She felt him stop, felt the pause of a man with something unfinished in his chest and not enough standing to finish it. "I'm sorry," he said. To her. Specifically, precisely to her. She let it land. She didn't deflect it, and she didn't receive it warmly, because warm was not what this was, and pretending otherwise would cheapen it. She let it be what it was. A real thing, imperfect, insufficient, and the most honest thing he'd said in her presence since she'd known him. "Go," she said. He went. The door closed. 3 people in the room now. Vero and his large man and the 2 of them, and the space had the specific quality of something that was going to resolve itself one way or another within the next several minutes. "The documentation," Nico said. "On the table," Vero said. There was a folder in the center of the table, brown, ordinary, the kind of folder you'd find in any office in any building in the city. Everything I have on the Holloway subsidiary, the account structure, the foundation transaction, the regulatory exposure. He paused. Complete. Nico looked at the folder. "Why is it on the table?" he said. "Because I want to show you I have it," Vero said, "before we discuss what I want for it." "We're not discussing that," Nico said. The temperature in the room shifted. Vero looked at him with the expression of a man encountering unexpected resistance in a situation he'd structured for compliance. The smoothness thinned slightly. "You came here, Serrano. You walked through that door. That's discussion." "I came here," Nico said, "to show you what tonight actually cost you. Not me. You." His voice was even and without heat, and that quality, the absence of heat, was itself a kind of information. 12 men. 6 of them are with my people now. 5 more are gone and not coming back. 1 made it to the highway. A pause. Sal Renner, who has been your intelligence asset for 4 months and who is, right now, explaining the full architecture of your involvement in tonight to a federal prosecutor who has been building a case on your Jersey operations for 14 months. Vero was very still. "That's not possible," he said. "Sal has a daughter," Nico said. "She's sick. The treatment is expensive. I've been paying for it since February." He held Vero's gaze without expression. "I've known about Sal for 4 months. I let him run because I needed to know the shape of what you were building. Tonight gave me the shape." He paused. "Sal isn't your asset. He never was. He's been mine." The silence that followed was the densest silence Celeste had experienced in a day of significant silences. She watched Vero's face perform a recalculation in real time, not panic because he was too constructed for panic, but the specific visible restructuring of a man who has just discovered that the foundation of a building he was standing in has been replaced with something he didn't choose. The documentation, Vero said. His voice had lost the first layer of smoothness. Not all of it. He was too experienced for all of it, but one layer, and the layer underneath was harder and more naked. Felix Renard spent the night restructuring the Holloway subsidiary, Celeste said. Both men looked at her. She looked at Vero. The entity has been remediated, and the documentation of remediation has been filed with the relevant regulatory body as of... She checked her phone. 40 minutes ago. Proactive disclosure. The story is controlled. There's nothing actionable in what you have in that folder. Vero looked at the folder on the table. He looked at it for a long moment. She had a thought, watching his face, about the nature of leverage, about how it only existed in the gap between what someone feared and what was actually true, and how closing that gap was the most effective form of power because it didn't require force. She'd closed the gap. Felix had closed the gap. Her father, who had answered his phone at midnight and said, "All right," had closed the gap. The federal case, Vero said. To Nico. Not a question anymore. A request for information. Is real, Nico said. And moving. You have some decisions to make about how you respond to it, and those are your decisions. But you're going to make them without the documentation as a bargaining chip, without Sal as an asset, without 12 men who are no longer available, and without the leverage you thought you had on my wife's family. He paused. The 6-year arrangement is over. Not because I'm ending it. The 6th year because you ended it tonight, and there isn't a version of it that comes back from that. Varo was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 15 seconds. You're not going to do anything in this room, he said. It was not quite a question. No, Nico said. You walked out of 12 men failing, and you'll walk out of this room. What happens after is what happens after. The large man near the door had gone very still, the stillness of someone assessing a situation and not liking the assessment. Varo looked at him briefly and made the same small motion with 2 fingers. Different meaning this time, a standing down rather than a directing. The large man's hands came away from his sides. Varo looked at Celeste one more time. The look was different from the first one. The first had been assessment. This one had something in it that was, not respect exactly, but its technical cousin, recognition of a variable he had underestimated. You're not what I expected, he said. You mentioned that, she said, on the phone, earlier. I meant it differently then, he said. She held his gaze. The folder, she said. I'll take it. He looked at her. It's mine, she said. My family's information. I'll take it. A pause that had the quality of a last calculation. Then Vero picked the folder up from the table and held it out, and she crossed the room and took it from his hand. And in the brief moment of exchange, she was close enough to see his face without any intervening distance. And what she saw there was not a monster. It was a man who had made a set of choices over a long time that had built him into something that now had nowhere left to expand, and who understood that, and who was going to have to live inside that understanding for whatever time came next. She stepped back. Nico looked at Varo one final time. Whatever passed between them in that look was in a language she didn't fully speak yet, the compressed, ancient vocabulary of men who have occupied the same territory and are now redistributing it. And then it was done. They left. The hall. The front door. The 3 a.m. street. Marco was at the curb. He looked at them and his face ran a rapid assessment and found what he was looking for, both upright, unbloodied, returning, and he opened the rear door without comment. She got in. Nico got in. The door closed. She sat with the folder in her lap and her hands on top of it, and she breathed, the full kind of breath, the kind she hadn't taken completely since the anteroom off the cathedral nave that morning, which had been almost 24 hours ago and which felt, sitting in the back of this car on a dark street in lower Manhattan, like something that had happened to a slightly different version of her. Nico sat beside her and said nothing, and she was grateful for it. After a minute, he reached over and put his hand over hers on the folder. She let him. They drove back to Westchester in the thinning dark, the city giving way to the bridge, and then to the county's wider roads and the specific silence of property and trees and distance from the density of everything. She didn't sleep. She didn't think she would sleep for some time yet. She sat and held the folder and watched the dark become something slightly less dark as the first edge of morning began at the horizon. The estate appeared with its lights on, all of them, the grounds lit fully, a brightness that was not celebration, but information. We're here. You're home. Everything that is ours is still standing. She walked through the front door and through the hall and into the sitting room with the books and the fireplace, and she set the folder on the desk, and she sat in the chair nearest the window and looked at it. Nico came in behind her. He went to the fireplace, unlit the hour past the need for performance, and stood with his back to it and looked at her. "It's done," he said. "Almost," she said. He waited. She opened the folder. She looked at the documents inside. Her name on the foundation paperwork, the account numbers, the subsidiary chain, Felix's restructuring addendum clipped to the back, the remediation filing timestamp at 2:17 in the morning. She looked at all of it, and she let herself feel, for the first time without the necessary suppression of an active situation, what it was to have built something good out of imperfect materials and have someone try to weaponize it. The community center on Lenox Avenue, 30 years old, built by a woman she'd never met, saved by money she'd never publicly claimed. The kind of act that happened in the world without fanfare, and therefore without defense, and which had found its defense anyway in the most unexpected form. A man who'd watched from a distance and chosen, on a Thursday morning in a cathedral, to stop watching. She took the folder to the fireplace. Nico looked at her. "I want to," she said. He stepped aside. She put the documents in and she found the matches on the mantel where matches lived in houses like this one. And she lit the edge of the first page and watched the thing that had been held over her family's head become something that only gave light. They stood and watched it. When it was done, she turned from the fireplace and sat back down in the chair, and Nico sat across from her, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was its own form of conversation and not an uncomfortable one. "My father is going to want to meet you properly," she said eventually. "I know," Nico said. "That's going to be an interesting conversation." "Yes. He's going to have opinions." "He should," Nico said. "His daughter married a stranger in under 20 minutes. He's entitled to opinions." She looked at him. "Are you going to tell him that you'd been watching me for 4 years?" Nico was quiet for a moment. "I'll tell him what he needs to know." "He needs to know that," she said. "Not because it changes anything, because it's the truth and I've decided I'm done living in houses where things are managed rather than said." She held his gaze. "That applies to this house too." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Then yes, I'll tell him." She nodded. "My mother will be easier," she said. "She told me not to let you make me small." Something crossed his face. "She's right to say it." "She is," Celeste said. "I'm holding you to the same standard I'm holding myself to, which means this." She gestured at the space between them, the room, the estate, the full implication of everything the day had constructed is not something I'm going to disappear into. I have work. I have the corporation, which needs significant attention now, and I have a board seat, and I have intentions for both that are going to require time and presence, and a partner who understands that my ambitions are not subordinate to his. "I know," Nico said. "You say that now." "I knew it before now," he said. "I knew it when you argued for 2 hours in a board meeting and then reached into your own account and did it anyway." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to understand was just how he looked when something mattered. "I didn't fall in love with someone who needed managing." The words landed in the room and stayed there. She let them stay. "That's the first time you've used that word," she said. "I know. We've been married for," she checked, 14 hours. "I know," he said. "I've also had 4 years of context." She looked at him. At the jaw that had history in it, and the eyes that were dark and complete, and the wound in his left side that was going to remind him for weeks of a night that had cost something real. At the man who had appeared in a doorway with fury in his posture and a name that emptied rooms and who had, in the quiet of a car on a highway, asked her if she was ready and accepted her yes as the full answer it was. "We're going to have to figure out what this is," she said. "Properly. Not in a crisis." "Yes," he said. "That's going to take time." "We have time," he said. "That's the thing about endings that aren't endings. They come with what's next." She held that. Outside, the morning was arriving. Not dramatically, not in the cinematic way that mornings arrived in stories, but in the way real mornings arrived, incrementally, gray becoming slightly less gray. The birds beginning their categorical noise, the world reasserting its ordinary requirements. She could hear it through the window she'd cracked an inch because she'd always slept better with air moving, which was a thing she'd done her whole life, and which she had never once told Grayson because she'd known instinctively that the information wouldn't be safe with him. She thought about safety, about what it meant to be in a place where the information about who you were was safe, about what it meant to choose that place rather than inherit it or default to it or be placed in it by someone else's plan. She had chosen this. In a cathedral, in 14 minutes, with crushed flowers in her hands and cold rage in her chest and the first clear-eyed decision she'd made in 2 years. She had chosen it, knowing nothing, and walking toward it anyway, which was the only way anything worth having ever got chosen. You didn't get to choose it with full information. You got to choose it with the information that mattered. And what had mattered was a man who drove 4 years of silence into a room and said, "I saw you," and was still standing there after midnight and gunfire and betrayal saying the same thing in different words. She reached over and put her hand on his forearm, where his sleeve was still rolled to the elbow, the fabric pushed up in the efficient way of a man who'd had things to do tonight. His skin was warm. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face. "Get some sleep," she said. "You've been shot." "Grazed," he said. "Semantics," she said. "Sleep." He almost smiled. The almost smile she'd seen fragments of all night and still hadn't seen in full, and she found she was willing to wait for the full version because waiting for things of genuine value was not the same as the kind of waiting she'd been doing for 2 years, which was waiting to be chosen by someone who had already made his choice. She stood and held out her hand. He took it, and this time she was the one asking the question, and he was the one answering. And the answer was the same as it had been since a cathedral full of people watched a stranger appear in the light of double doors and walk the full length of a nave toward a woman who dropped her flowers and refused to leave. Yes. Months later, the city was still talking about it. Not in the breathless way it talked immediately after, not with the quality of spectacle that attached itself to the first days, when every news cycle and social page and whispered corner of every boardroom had some version of the story, but in the quieter, more durable way that cities eventually talk about things that have genuinely rearranged their landscape, in the way that people mention something that has become part of the structure of how things are. Celeste took the chair at the Holloway Corporation's board in February, 3 months after the wedding that was still the most documented event of the prior year's social season. She did it without ceremony, walked into the boardroom, sat down, and began with the agenda item she'd been planning since November, which was a structural overhaul of the subsidiary architecture that her father's predecessor, CFO, had left in the corporation's foundations like a structural fault. She had Felix's analysis and her own, and she presented both with the flat-footed directness of someone who had permanently stopped apologizing for taking up space in rooms. Edmund Holloway sat 2 chairs to her right and said nothing during the presentation, which was itself a statement about how things had shifted between them. They had their conversations now. Not warm ones. Warmth wasn't their language, and she'd stopped expecting it. But honest ones. Which was better? He'd met Nico in January, in the study of the Westchester estate, and the conversation had lasted 3 hours, and she hadn't been in the room for it, which had been Nico's suggestion, and which she'd accepted because she understood that some things needed to be said between men in the vocabulary they'd built over their lives before other vocabularies could be added. Her father had come out of that room looking like a man who'd been shown something he wasn't certain how to categorize, which, for Edmund Holloway, was as close to impressed as she'd likely ever see. The Vero operation didn't collapse dramatically. It contracted. The federal case that had been building for 14 months finally broke surface in March, and the resulting pressure redistributed the territory and the alliances in ways that took months to settle. Vero himself was not indicted in the first round. He was a careful man, and careful men knew how to sit at the edge of legal consequence without falling in. But his position changed, and the change was the irreversible kind. And Celeste understood this without needing the details because she'd seen his face in that conference room, and she knew the look of a man whose architecture had been found wanting. Sal Renner's daughter received treatment at a hospital in Boston. This was information she had from Nico and didn't ask further about, because there was a category of how things got handled that she was still learning, and that she was learning at a pace that was hers and not anyone else's. And some of it she understood immediately, and some of it she held at a slight distance until she was ready. What she understood about Sal was this: a man who made a catastrophic choice under catastrophic pressure was still a man, and the choice could be answered, and the man could be something other than the answer. She didn't forgive it, but she didn't reduce him to it either. Grayson Vale left New York in January. She knew this because the city told her, in the way it always told things, through the peripheral information of shared spaces and social accounts, and the occasional third-party mention that arrived and passed like weather. He'd gone somewhere west. She heard Colorado, then California, heard both again in conflicting sequences, and didn't resolve them. He'd sold what remained of his assets under duress and at losses that were significant and unsurprising, and that closed the chapter of his debt to Vero's structure in a way that left him with a clean exit and almost nothing else. She thought about him occasionally, not with longing and not with the kind of satisfaction she'd imagined she might feel when the distance between them became final. With something more like the feeling you have when you look at a scar and can't quite remember the moment of impact. It was real. It happened. The evidence is in the skin, and the skin has moved on. The community center on Lenox Avenue was still open. She went in April on a Tuesday afternoon, alone. She hadn't told Nico she was going, and he hadn't asked where she'd been when she came home, because they were still learning the grammar of each other's space, what required reporting and what required only return. She walked through the building that had been built by a woman she'd never met and maintained by a city that didn't fully know who had helped keep it alive, and she stood in the main room where the afternoon light came through high windows and children were doing something loud and specific in the back. And she thought about all the anonymous things that held the world up, all the choices made in private that had no audience and no credit and no story. She'd made one 4 years ago, and it had found her anyway, had built, without her knowledge, the bridge that brought a man across a cathedral floor on the worst day of her life. The world had strange accounting. She put money into the foundation account again before she left. More than the first time. Not anonymously. Her name on the transfer, clean and direct, the way she intended to put her name on things from now on. On a night in May, she stood at the window of the bedroom that had become, without specific negotiation, the room they shared in the Westchester house. The window faced the grounds, and beyond them the tree line, and above the tree line, the sky that was doing the full evening thing, orange and deep blue, and the first stars coming through. She had a glass of water in her hand, and she was wearing the robe that she'd bought herself at the beginning of April that was the wrong size by the world's reckoning and exactly her size by her own, and she stood in it without adjustment or apology. Nico came in from this hall. He'd been on the phone. She could tell from the particular quality of his arrival, the slight closing down of something that opened again when the door shut behind him. He came and stood beside her at the window. He'd smiled. Fully, finally. She'd seen it for the first time in February, in the kitchen, over something that was barely funny, and it had arrived on his face like a structural revelation, the thing underneath all the compression. She'd gotten used to it, which was its own kind of gift. "My father called," she said. "What did he want?" "To tell me the board approved the subsidiary restructuring," she said. "And to say—" She paused. He said, "Well done." The quiet of someone who understands what 2 words can cost a man like Edmund Holloway. "That's significant," Nico said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They stood at the window. The evening moved in the way evenings moved when there was nothing required of you, slowly, warmly, in the direction of rest. She thought about the cathedral, and she thought about the anteroom and the cold stone wall and the hand she'd pressed against it, and the woman who had stood in $43,000 of structural engineering and told herself one more time. That woman was not gone. She was still there, in the same body, in the same skin. But the position had changed, from the wall to the window, from braced to open, from the practiced apology to the deliberate claim. She no longer shrank, not because someone had fixed her or saved her or told her to stop, because she had stood at an altar with crushed flowers in her hands and made a choice that was entirely her own, and everything that had followed, the fear and the negotiation and the fire in the grate and the folder that was now ash, had been, at its center, the simple accumulated weight of choosing. The city below and behind and all around them was still talking. Some called her a survivor. Some called her a queen. Nico knew what she was. So did she. The stars came through, one and then several and then the full quantity of them, and the night settled over the grounds and over the house and over the two people at the window who had found each other by the most unlikely route and were still finding each other still, in the slow and daily way that mattered more than any single dramatic moment, and the world made room. It always makes room, in the end, for people who refuse to disappear.